Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I welcome you all to our Ramadan prep webinar, the topic of which is controlling your nafs. This webinar has been brought to you by several sponsors, including Habibi Halaqas, I Got It Covered, Muslima's Oasis, Muslima's Source, and suhaibweb.com. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "And the gates of heaven will be open in this month, and the gates of hell will be closed, and the devils will be chained." Then why is it that we sin during the month of Ramadan when the devils are chained? Scholars have said that the possible reason is because the shayateen have affected us so much that even when they're chained, their effects cause us to do something that is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They cause us to sin. But Ramadan is the best time to detox and flush those bad habits and form good ones that inshallah will last us the entire year. So in this webinar, Sister Yasmin Mogahed will share tips with us on how to accomplish this goal. So without further ado, I would like to present Sister Yasmin Mogahed.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Inshallah, today we're going to be talking about a very, very important topic, and that is the topic of Ramadan and how to really prepare ourselves for Ramadan in the context of training our nafs. Now, I'll have to, admit that I feel very strange talking without having, a visible audience and not being able to hear you. But inshallah, I'll be able to cope. And inshallah, I want to be able to interact with you through the chat after, after this section is finished. I want to be able to, inshallah, leave enough time so that we can interact. And I want to hear your questions and your reflections. That's very important to me. So to begin the topic of training the nafs and the topic of how we should enter Ramadan, we have to really start from the beginning. And the beginning really goes back to the essential question of what is our purpose? What is our purpose of existence? Now, this is a question that has been asked by people, philosophers, basically from the beginning of time. Why are we here? What is our purpose? Why were we put in this world, and what are we intended to accomplish? And while this is something that has been, many philosophers have discussed this issue, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually given us the answer to this question, very clear answer to this quest. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وما خلقت الجن والإنس إلا ليعبدون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains in this ayah that He has not created jinn and human beings except for one single purpose. And that purpose is to fulfill ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the reason why we exist, the reason why we were created, is for this one singular purpose. Now, the construction of this ayah is important because you'll notice that the ayah begins with a negation. It says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just say that we created mankind for this purpose, but rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we have not created mankind for any other purpose. So you begin by negating any other purpose for which we were created, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this one single purpose. And in order to understand this ayah, we really have to be able to define the concept of ubudiyyah. What is ubudiyyah? A lot of times, we hear this word, we've heard probably this ayah many times, but the question is, what really is the meaning of ubudiyyah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he says that our purpose is ubudiyya, ubudiyya can be defined as living our life in such a way, living in this universe and living every second of our life in such a way that our intent is in accordance with the intent of our Creator. So what that means is that my focus is the same as what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants my focus to be, that my intent and my goals are as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to be, that there is an accordance between my intent and the intent of my Creator. When I live my life so that internally and externally we have the same focus, and that's my goal is the same as what Allah's goal is for me, then that is ubudiyya. Now ubudiyya, the thing is that when you really actualize ubudiyya, there is a consequence of that. And the consequence of ubudiyya is extremely important. The consequence of proper ubudiyya, proper worship of Allah, when I am in line with my Creator and my goal is the same as what He wants from me, and my intent and my focus is the same as what He has, He wants that focus and that intent to be. The consequence of ubudiyya is something extremely profound, and that is salam. It is peace. That when I am in a state of ubudiyya to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the consequence of that is that I attain peace. And that peace begins inside of myself. And when I have that peace inside of myself, then I can actualize peace outside of myself. And if you look at one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is al-salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the peace. And in a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, one of the ad'iyah of the Prophet, he would say, Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam. Not only is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the peace, as-salam, He is the source of peace. Minka salam, which means from you comes peace. You are the source of peace. Now, if you think about this concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the source of peace, what that means is that there is no other way to get peace except by seeking the source. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والله يدعو إلى دار السلام وَيَهْدِي مَن يَشَاءُ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that He is calling us to the home of salam, the home of peace. And if you think, I want you to think about for a second this metaphor. Imagine that someone is in the middle of a desert and they are desperate for water, and there's only one source of water in that desert. Now think about what would happen if you are far away from that source of water. If you are far from that source of water, are you ever going to quench your thirst? And if you are far from that source of water, are you ever going to be able to give water to others? You won't be able to. The only way that you can quench that thirst is by being nearer and nearer to that source. So by being the more near that I am to that source of water, the more that I can quench my thirst and the more that I can give to others. But if we are not close to the source of water, we can never quench our thirst. And similarly, if we are not near Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the source of peace, we can never ever attain peace. And in that same vein, the nearer that I am to that source, the more I will have of it. So the nearer I am to the source of water, the more water I will have. The nearer I am to the source of peace, the more peace that I will have. And again, it's important to understand, obviously in this life, this is not a physical nearness. This is a nearness of our qalb, of our heart, of our soul, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that heart, when we say qalb, it's translated as heart, but qalb is an inner characteristic and a quality which is connected to the physical heart, but it's not the physical heart. The qalb is the part of the human being. The heart is the part of the human being that connects to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this life, before the next life. But here is the thing, in order to attain this nearness to the source of water, to the source of peace, there are two things which we must do. There are two requirements in order to attain nearness to this source of peace. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about those in the following ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is saying that Allah has sent, it is He who has sent among the unlettered an apostle from among themselves. So he's saying that He has sent the Prophet ﷺ for a certain purpose. And what that purpose was to rehearse on them His signs and لِيُزَكِّيهِمْ, in order to purify them and to instruct them in scripture and in manifest wisdom. Now, if you notice here, there are two components mentioned in this ayah. And those two components are, first, knowledge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He sent the messenger. He sent the messenger in order to give them knowledge and in order to purify them. And that before this, and in order to give them that wisdom, and that before that they were in manifest error. And so the two components in order to be able to attain the peace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to attain that source of peace, is knowledge, and the second one is purification. Purification of the inner self. So if we're going to begin to undertake this journey to the nearness, to this source of peace, we have to undergo this process of tazkiyah. And in fact, if you look at even the word sharia literally means the trodden path to the source of water. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us sharia, which literally means it's a path to water. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us sharia in order to reach that source of water and that source of peace, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then the question is, where does Siyam fit in? Where does fasting fit in? Where does Ramadan fit in? Now I'm going to pause for a second in order to be able to, those of you who are taking notes can take down some of the, the definitions that I did give in some of the ayat. The ayah that I had quoted regarding where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls to the home of peace is chapter 10 verse 25. And this is the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He is calling us to the home of peace, whereas there are many other calls in our life and in the dunya which are calling us to everything other than the home of peace. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling to that state, to that place. Next is the ayah that I quoted regarding the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent His messenger in order to give us knowledge and in order to purify us. That these are two requirements for this path to the source of peace, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's chapter 62 verse 2. And then we talked about the sharia, the concept of sharia, that the very definition of sharia is it's the path to water. And that if we follow this path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's the only way that we're going to achieve the true source of peace. Now, this brings us to the idea of what does all of this have to do with fasting? What does all of this have to do with Ramadan? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us Ramadan in order to aid us in this process. Now the way in which this happens is that we know that we have basically two things or two entities which prevent us from seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's basically two blocks that keep us from being good, from seeking that path to the source of peace and the source of water. And what are those two things? Those two things are shaitan, which we know is our external enemy, and he is the source of this outer whispering that happens in our mind and in our heart. But there's a second aspect, there's a second block that keeps us from the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the nafs. And that's what we're going to talk about inshallah today. The nafs is the inner inclinations. That's my own self. It's my inner inclination to do bad. Yeah, all of us, subhanAllah, we want to seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we're believers, and the reason why we're on this call is because we want to seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but yet we're human beings, and we have ailments, we have inner ailments. Sometimes we get angry, sometimes we feel hatred, we feel selfishness, arrogance, prejudice, fear. These are all inner ailments which prevent me from attaining that peace by being near to the source of peace. And so in order to seek and in order to reach that source of peace, I have to clean myself of those inner ailments. And that is the process of tazkiyatun nafs. That's the process of training and purifying the self. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when Ramadan begins, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ, this is a hadith of the Prophet, and it's narrated by Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ says that when the month of Ramadan begins, the gates of the paradise are opened, and the gates of hellfire are closed, and the shayateen, the devils, are chained. So this makes us kind of stop and reflect. Now, a lot of times we think, okay, we hear this hadith since we're young, and so we think, okay, we're going to go into Ramadan and we're going to become angels, right? Because now that shaitan is chained up, we should all be able to be angels. But what we find is that we're still not angels, right? Ramadan comes and we're still making mistakes, we're still sinning, we're still falling into error. And so then the question is, why? Why is it that we continue to do that? Well, if you think about when you're in school and you're trying to figure out, if you're doing an experiment and you're trying to narrow down the cause of something, in order to narrow down what is the cause of a particular event, you have to eliminate other possible causes in order to see if it will still affect the event. Well, in this case, when Ramadan comes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is removing the other factor, which is shaitan. So anything that I do in Ramadan, I now know it's not from shaitan. I can't blame shaitan, because now shaitan is chained up. Now I can only blame my own nafs. So Ramadan is a time when we really learn about the nafs. Ramadan is a time when I have to face my nafs, because it's just me and my nafs. Shaitan is not involved anymore. And so Ramadan is a time when I encounter my nafs. And if I do wrong, there's no one else to blame. This is something, if there's anything I want, inshallah, us to take away from this talk, it's this, that true freedom. We live in a society where they teach you that freedom is freedom of the self. But this is actually absolutely untrue. It's the opposite. True freedom is freedom from the self, not freedom of the self. And if there's anything you write down, I want you to write this down, that the true freedom of the human being is when they are free from their self, from their nafs, rather than having freedom of the self or of the nafs. To be truly liberated is to be free from the chains of my own self. That is true freedom. And freedom of the self is actually the opposite. Because when my nafs is free and my nafs is in control of me, then I'm actually a slave. I'm not free at all. So when people say things like, the idea of, a lot of times you hear this phrase of people say, follow your heart. But a lot of times when people say follow your heart, they really mean follow your nafs. And the reason for that is that sometimes when the nafs becomes so strong, it takes over the heart. And now the nafs is in charge, the nafs is in control. And so, when you become, enslaved to your nafs, that's not freedom, that's actually slavery. And indulging the self does something else. It disengages you from the freedom of exalting in more knowledge and more nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, what does that still have to do with fasting? Well, I want you guys to think for a second, if we are so busy in the, in loving to eat, and that's what we do most of the time, what happens when our focus is on the physical pleasure? And when I say physical pleasure, that includes, the physical appetite, basically, right? That when my focus is on the physical appetite of feeding my physical body, then that means that my focus is not on the spiritual aspect, the heart and the soul, because all I'm thinking about is what am I going to eat, what am I going to drink, what am I going to cook, and what I do is I'm seeking, and subhanAllah, I think probably at some point or at some level, a lot of us can relate to, when you're just feeling really stressed out, or you're feeling really sad, sometimes we'll go to food, right? We'll seek comfort in food. And I mean, there's that whole, stereotype of like chocolate ice cream and us women and stuff like that. But the idea here is that there is some truth to this concept, that we do seek to fill some sort of void in ourselves through food. We seek to to fulfill and to seek, to gain some sort of pleasure, but it's a physical pleasure, and it's again, we're giving into the physical needs of the body. When you take away that focus, when you take away the focus from the physical need, now your focus is free to be directed towards the spiritual needs, towards the needs of the heart and of the soul. And by fasting, something that we realize is that we can find happiness in something other than the physical world. And that is extremely profound, that the idea that I can find pleasure and I can find fulfillment in something other than the physical, material world. And by leaving, food and drink and intimate relations, is that by doing that, I am finding that there's this whole other world where I can find a truer and deeper and realer, fulfillment and happiness that has nothing to do with the physical needs or the physical pleasure. The other aspect is that when I disengage from focusing on food, or again, just in general, the physical appetite or the physical pleasure, now I have been able to free my mind in order to engage intellectually with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I can focus on, the deeper sorts of truths in my life. If my whole focus is having fun and indulging in all these different types of entertainment, then when am I really going to be engaged intellectually? So what Sawm does, what fasting does, is it liberates me from my addictions. Sawm is intended to liberate us. Allah disengages us from our addiction to food and drink so that we can realize that life is beyond the physical needs. There is joy and pleasure and happiness that is not physical and it's not materialistic. So that I don't think that the physical nourishment is the means to pleasure and happiness. And you'll notice that, subhanAllah, it's the same with prayers. Because if you think about salah, 5 times a day, I have to interrupt what I'm doing, which is usually something mundane or limited or material. And I have to interrupt that in order that I don't become dependent or addicted to that thing. By interrupting whatever it is I'm doing in my life throughout the day and going to pray, I am cutting myself off from it. And by doing that, I am preventing myself from becoming addicted, dependent, or a prisoner to what it is that I need to do daily. So I have to, obviously, I have to go to work, I have to interact with people, I have to do things of the dunya. I have to, obviously we all live in the dunya and we must live in the dunya. But the question is, how do we live in the dunya without becoming addicted, attached, and a prisoner to the dunya? And subhanAllah, Allah gives us exactly the prescription to be able to live in the dunya without being drowned by it, without being addicted to it, without being a prisoner to it. And so in the case of salah, by breaking away 5 times a day, I am disengaging from the dunya in a way that I can refocus on what is internal. And that my nafs does not get used to being in a state of focus on material things, the mundane and the worldly things. Now, if you think about a situation where you never took a break, you were just involved in your dunya. So, you're in your job, or you're dealing with people, whatever it is that you're doing, and you never take a break to just stop and look inward. What happens if you do that? If you never take a break and stop and look inwardly, then what happens is that my whole world is going to become about what is happening outside of myself. That starts to define my whole world. So whatever is happening in my life outside of me defines me. And so what ends up happening then is I go up and down with the ups and downs in my environment. And anyone who's lived in this dunya for longer than 3 minutes realizes that the dunya is nothing but ups and downs. The dunya is nothing but change and inconstancy. And so if I am all about what is happening outside of myself in the dunya, external, then what that means is internally I will never have peace. Internally I will never have constancy. I will never have stillness internally, because all of my focus is on what is happening outside of myself. It's on what is happening in the mundane, what is happening in my dunya. But if I stop and 5 times a day, now if we do this right, this is what it's about. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a prescription, but in order for it to work, you have to follow the prescription. And if I follow this prescription and I break away 5 times a day, then what I'm doing, and again, this is if I'm praying properly and I have khushu' and I have focus of heart and mind, then what I'm doing is I'm pulling myself away from the focus external and I'm refocusing internal. And I'm looking at the things which are not seen, the things which I wouldn't otherwise notice if I didn't stop to take that break. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, out of His mercy, this prescription for how to be successful while still living in the dunya, but not letting the nafs take over, not letting the dunya take over. In the case of siyam, I am disconnecting from a physical, almost like I'm disconnecting from the physical world, because hunger is a physical need, and eating is a physical, you satiate yourself, but you're satiating yourself physically. So what I do is I cut off the physical satiation, and instead I fill myself with what is spiritual. I'm feeding my soul. So it's kind of like I'm starving my body but feeding my soul when I fast. And subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He put us in this world, but He didn't just leave us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us exactly the prescription of how to be successful in this life. And siyam is very, 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 it is a huge part of that. When I don't break away from the physical needs and from the dunya, what ends up happening internally is that my heart starts to die, because all of my attachments are material. All of my attachments are to the dunya, which is again constantly changing and is fading away. And so my heart then starts to die, and I start to develop more inner ailments. I start to develop more diseases in my heart. Sawm is an opportunity to liberate myself from these attachments, and therefore the addiction to what is not lasting, to what is not ultimate. Because you know what, the human being, and this is again, if you look at the society that we live in, all of the focus is on the physical being. All of the focus is on, pleasure, physical pleasure, material things that I can feel and touch, and again, all of it is within the physical realm. But here's the thing: no one can argue that I am not just a physical being, right? Now, obviously there's more to me than just my physical self. And the reason why I know that is because, for example, we feel pain, and it may have nothing to do with our body. Our body may be completely well, and there is nothing hurting our body, but we still feel pain. What is it that's feeling that pain? It's something other than the physical being. There's another non-physical part of me. I also feel joy. Again, that's not something that I feel in my physical body. I think. When I think, is that physical? So how can we possibly follow a philosophy of life that are just about the physical? Eating, sleeping, drinking, and being merry, right, in the physical sense. This is denying a very important component of my being, which is the non-physical component. Then the question is, how do I feed that non-physical component? How do I feed my soul? Well, guess what? Chances are you're not going to see that on commercials, on TV. The commercials on TV don't talk about feeding your soul. The commercials on TV don't talk about, being a better, being more honest or being more sincere or connecting to God. The commercials are usually just about the physical world, as if I was just a physical creature. Now, when Ramadan comes, fasting liberates me from all of that. I begin to know that there really is life beyond the physical realm, and there is joy beyond material joy. And one of the consequences of this, you'll find, is that I start to feel more kindness and compassion towards the people who don't have what I have. So when I am fasting, I am voluntarily keeping myself from food and water and any kind of drink. But there are people who are involuntarily have to keep themselves from food and drink, and that's because they don't have the means to buy food and drink. And so by doing this, I also am able to feel more compassion towards the poor and towards those who don't have a home to come back to for iftar, and these large extravagant dinners that we have, to break our fast. And inshallah, I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how that really misses the point of what Ramadan and what Siyam is really supposed to do. Actually there's a statistic that shows that in fact in Ramadan, people spend more money. Now this is very ironic. In Ramadan, people actually spend more money on food and desserts than they do outside of Ramadan. So Ramadan came in order to take the focus off of food and put the focus on the non-physical world. And yet a lot of us Muslims, what we do is we do the opposite. We actually put more focus on what we're eating. We just kind of wait till iftar to do it, right? So you'll find that there is such an emphasis on this idea of having extravagant iftars and what are we going to eat, and we put so much money and thought into having very fancy food and desserts and everything like that. But this completely misses the point. The whole point of Ramadan is not just for us to be hungry and thirsty. The whole point of Siyam is to show the nafs, to show the individual that there is more to life than the physical world. There is more to life than the material pleasure and the material joy. That there is a deeper and realer joy and a deeper and realer fulfillment than just eating, sleeping, and drinking. So subhanAllah, we really, we have to have the correct focus of why it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to fast. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about fasting in the Quran, He gives inshallah I'll get to that, but He gives a reason why fasting was prescribed. And when we, again indulge, so what we do, we fast all day and then we indulge in food at the end of the day. The reason why this misses the point is because when we, practically speaking, when we eat so much at the end of the day, now what happens is, and we've all experienced this, I'm sure, at some point or another, we feel like so, almost, just drowsy, right? Our mind is almost asleep. And when we go to salah, inshallah we go to salah after we break our fast, we feel almost just unable to focus in salah. We feel like the mind is bored, the mind is sluggish. And what we've done now is, because we have eaten so much, our mind becomes clouded, we're extremely tired. And this goes against the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, who he used to break his fast with, and as soon as to break his fast with dates and or water, and then go to salah, and then have break his fast on something small, pray maghrib, and then come back and eat. But filling the stomach, what that does is it numbs the mind. And I think that, subhanAllah, this is probably one of the reasons why when someone is feeling depressed or feeling down or feeling anxious, they do seek food. Because, subhanAllah, there's something about food that when you go to food and you fill yourself, there's a sort of numbness that happens. I don't have to now feel anymore. It's sort of it's a sort of an anesthesia, so that I don't have to really face what it is that's bothering me, or I don't have to really feel it. And so this is really something that food can do when you overindulge in it. So keeping in mind that the focus of Ramadan is not what we're going to eat for iftar. The focus is not how fancy it is, or how many different dishes we're going to serve or eat. The focus is exactly the opposite. Now, I want to talk about the idea, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about fasting in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, in Surah Al-Baqarah, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that fasting was prescribed for you, as it was prescribed for those who came before you, for a very particular reason, and that is so that we may attain taqwa. So the purpose of fasting is for me to attain taqwa. The question is, what is taqwa? Now taqwa derives from the Arabic word waqa, waqi, which literally means to protect or to shield. And it also comes from the word ittaqa, which means to protect oneself. So taqwa is a noun derived from this meaning, and what it means is to shield or protect oneself. The question is, what are we shielding and protecting ourselves from through siyam? Well, we're protecting ourselves from a lot of things. First and foremost, we're protecting and shielding ourselves from the displeasure and the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're protecting ourselves from the distance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're also protecting ourselves from excessively indulging the nafs. And we're protecting ourselves from shaitan. So Sawm is almost like a shield. Sawm is an invisible shield around me. And when I'm fasting, now I'm focused on the spiritual, and when you fast, now what you have done is it focuses you on your spiritual and moral energies instead of your physical energies. And as a result of that, now I am building my spiritual and moral strength in order to be able to take my nafs, in order to be able to oppose and train my nafs. So, just to summarize, by fasting and by shielding myself from the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and from what the nafs wants, right? Because part of what the nafs wants is the physical satiation, which includes food. By doing that, I'm strengthening my spiritual and moral strength. And you know what, it's really interesting because you can have a heavyweight champion. He could be the heavyweight champion of the world, but this person is unable to fight their own nafs. So they have all this physical strength, but they have no inner strength. So what fasting does is it gives you that inner moral and spiritual strength so that you have the ability to fight your nafs. And it makes your path to doing good easier for you. And everyone probably has experienced this, that when you're fasting, you feel that it's easier to do more ibadah, right? It's easier to, be strict with your salah. It's easier to read more Quran. It's easier to go to the masjid. Fasting, when you're fasting, when you're starving, in a sense, your body, you are feeding your soul. That's what I want you to remember. You starve the body in order to feed the soul. You disengage your focus from the physical world in order to focus and engage your focus on the inner spiritual world. Now, the other aspect about Ramadan, which is extremely important, is that Ramadan is about mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that during Ramadan, Allah's mercy always encompasses everything, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Rahmati wasi'at kulli shay, that my mercy encompasses every single thing. And yet there are certain times that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is nearer to us than other times. And for example, one of those times is in sajda. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it such that when we are in sajda, in that physical position, in time and space, that we're actually closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Similarly, when we are near to the Kaaba, when we're close to the Kaaba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it so that we are even nearer to Him in that physical space. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also done that with Ramadan. During Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's almost like He actually changes the makeup of the universe, where now the entire universe is closer to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is more engrossed and more full of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And subhanAllah, this is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to bring us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order for us to take advantage of His mercy and to really change ourselves, to really go through Ramadan and come out changed. We do not want Ramadan and fasting to just be about hunger and thirst. If we do not realize the purpose of fasting, that this purpose is so that I can stop worrying about my physical needs and worry instead about my spiritual needs of my heart and of my soul. And that number one need, there is only one thing that feeds the heart, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is nothing else that's going to feed your heart. And so when I am able to empty out all the other focus, now I can focus on what really is going to feed me. And this is what Sawm, and this is what fasting, and this is what Ramadan is all about. So we have to make sure, and I tell myself first and all of you, that we don't let Ramadan and fasting just be about, leaving food and drink, that it just be about being hungry and thirsty, but that we see the inner purpose of Ramadan, and that we go through Ramadan and come out changed, come out different, that Ramadan is a purifier of our nafs, because in Ramadan you will encounter your nafs, because in Ramadan the shayateen are chained, and now it's just you and your own nafs. During Ramadan, this rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is optimized. There's that change in the universe. The rahmah is so close to us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the owner of mercy. And the Prophet ﷺ tells us that when Ramadan comes, its beginning is mercy, its middle is forgiveness, and its ending is liberation from the hellfire. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us this month in order to lift us up and in order to bring us back to His forgiveness and to liberate us from Jahannam. Wa'udhu billah. So what I want, inshallah, all of us to leave with is, first of all, an intention, a deep intention, because the Prophet ﷺ says, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that everything is by your intention, and that everybody will have what they intended. So I want, first and foremost, before we leave this webinar, to make an intention that I will not make this Ramadan just about being hungry and thirsty, but I will make this Ramadan about inner transformation, about inner purification, about building my connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking His mercy, because His mercy is so close to us in Ramadan. And the Prophet ﷺ tells us that whoever fasts during Ramadan out of sincere faith and hoping to attain Allah's reward, then all of his sins will be forgiven. I want, inshallah, to really emphasize this. You and I have an opportunity to have all of our sins forgiven. Imagine that. We have this opportunity, but what we really need to do is to realize why we're fasting. Go into Ramadan with the proper focus and the proper intention, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy on us and to allow us to come out of Ramadan completely, inshallah, purified and changed, inshallah. And the way that you're really going to know that Ramadan did its purpose is the fact that after it's over, you're still changed. See, if we go into Ramadan and we change things about ourselves, and as soon as Ramadan is over, we go back to the way we were before, then we really haven't changed. We haven't actually, Ramadan did not fulfill its purpose, because Ramadan came to purify us and to change us and to elevate us, and that change, it has to be lasting. And so what we want to do is take Ramadan as a fuel in order to bring us nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but to carry that on after Ramadan is over. And any habits that we pick up in Ramadan, let's inshallah make the intention to continue those habits even after Ramadan is over. And we hope, inshallah, that Ramadan allows us to rise above ourselves, to rise above our nafs, to free ourselves from our nafs, and inshallah to find the only path to peace. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم. سبحانك الله وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. While I'm waiting for questions and reflections, inshallah, to come in, I do want to give some more, another piece of advice, which is that one thing that we should really, one practical tip that's really going to help us be able to fulfill the purpose of Ramadan is qiyam. Now, qiyam is the salah that is right before Fajr. Now, when I talked earlier about the nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the times when we are nearest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in this time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that during this time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends to the nearest heaven, to the lowest heaven, in the time just before Fajr. And He asks of us, who is calling on me so I can answer their call? Who is seeking my forgiveness so I can forgive them? So if we really want to benefit from Ramadan, we should be very, very careful not to lose this opportunity to pray at this very blessed time, and to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during that time, to make tawbah, to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ask Him for His forgiveness, and make dua, because this is the time of dua, and this is the time to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so we were talking about how do we keep from getting, involved and busy in the chores, iftar, suhoor, taking care of the kids, and losing our focus. This is extremely important because we want, we get the reward, obviously, of the fasting person when we invite and we feed fasting people. This is highly encouraged in Islam. But what we have to make sure to do is that the focus is not on what is being eaten, right? What we're eating, but rather the focus is on what is the purpose of staying away from, what was the purpose of Ramadan to begin with, and that is really to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I would say we have to be very conscious of keeping that balance, especially as women, keeping that balance of taking care of our responsibilities at home, cooking, taking care of the suhoor, taking care of the iftar, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward us for those things. But at the same time, not losing focus on the internal work that we need to do. If we lose focus on our internal work, we die inside, and our hearts become disconnected from the source of water. And what happens when you disconnect from the source of water in the middle of a desert is you become dehydrated. The heart cannot handle disconnecting from the source of its water, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So make sure that you're doing both. Make sure that you're nourishing that inner need for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at the same time taking care of your external obligations. The next question is, what advice do you give to brothers and sisters who will be working and studying during Ramadan? How can we keep our nafs strong and not get too distracted at the task at hand, inshallah? Such a beautiful question, and it gets right to the heart of what we were talking about, which is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the tools to be in this dunya without being addicted or imprisoned by the dunya. And so in this case, the case of you have to be working or you have to be studying, my advice is realize that everything comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the first thing. If we realize this, we wouldn't have the same fear and the same anxiety about everything. So what I mean by that, if I have an exam, where exactly is the tawfiq for that exam going to come from? Where is where is the success going to come from in that exam? It comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what I would say is this, if you make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala your focus, and I'm not talking about abandoning any of your obligations, but I'm talking about if you make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala your focus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does something amazing. He takes care of your worldly affairs. And this is a fact. And we're told this in a number of ahadith, but really experientially you can see this, that when you make Allah first, and your eyes and your face is focused, your focus is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will suffice you. Allah will take care of your worldly needs, and He'll help. So for example, say I have an exam coming up, or I have to wake up early for work, and my nafs, in this case, because shaitan is chained, might say, well, you have to wake up early tomorrow, so you probably shouldn't go to Taraweeh, or you shouldn't wake up and pray Qiyam because you're going to be so tired. This, you have to oppose that whispering of your nafs, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can make you more productive and give you more barakah in your time and in your studies and in your exam, if you do go and you make Him the focus and you put Him first. So my advice again, keep your focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't neglect any of your obligations, but keep your focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Make Him a priority, and He will take care of your worldly affairs, inshallah. Next question is, what would you suggest for someone who knows and understands that Ramadan is more than just being hungry, yet despite this fact, they are feeling very hungry in these long and hot days, and they seem like they're losing their patience and losing their focus and doing good deeds, like reading Quran or volunteering? What would be your advice in this situation? My first advice in this situation is to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help. Is to make dua. One fact that we have to realize is that the help only comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing comes from myself. And so if I'm struggling, who am I going to go to for help? I have to go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if I go to Allah and tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm struggling, I'm having trouble, I'm falling, I'm failing. This is part of being human. We have to understand that we are human beings, we're not angels, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not expect us to be angels, because He gave us obviously the ability to have free will. And so the idea here is not that we expect perfection from ourselves, but that we realize that we need Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we need His help. And yes, fasting is difficult, and yes, we get hungry, and yes, we get impatient, and that's all part of being human, and that's all part of the training. This is a training for myself, and it is going to be difficult, and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can make it easy. And so my advice is, go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let it be a means to humble yourself and get nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, admit your need, admit your weakness, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for you. We have a question. Since you mentioned qalb is not the physical heart but our connection with Allah, then in the Quran, when the qalb is mentioned, is it referring to the ruh, intellect? Can you explain what is the qalb if it is not the physical heart we think of? Qalb is separate from the ruh, is separate from the intellect. Those are three separate entities, three separate things. So the qalb is the part of the heart which we know from the Prophet ﷺ and from the words of the scholars. The qalb is actually the sovereign of the individual. The qalb is actually what leads the human being. It's not the intellect, as we think, we're told in this society that it's your mind. It's actually the qalb. The qalb is actually in control of the mind, which is very interesting. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ says in a hadith that there is a piece of flesh in the body, and if it is set right, then the entire body will be set right. And if it is corrupted, the entire body will be corrupted, and surely it is the qalb, it is the heart. So the heart is actually what's in charge. And so the idea that my intellect leads me, and it's actually the heart, and whatever condition your heart is in will affect your intellect. Whatever condition your heart is in will affect your thinking. And so the idea that I can be okay by just thinking my way through things is absolutely wrong, because the only way that I can be able to think properly and to think correctly is if my heart is pure, if my heart is clean, because the heart is actually what's in charge. And the ruh is also something, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the nafs and nufus, he said there are different types of souls, different types of selves, three categories of selves that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran: النفس المطمئنة, النفس الأمارة بالسوء, and النفس اللوامة. And these categories, three categories, they talk about states of the self. So it's not that I'm born in one state and I will never change, but these are things that change throughout life depending on what state I'm in. And the meaning of them, nafs al-mutma'inna, is the self which is at peace. This is the believing soul that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to in Surah Al-Fajr when He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls to this particular type of soul at the time of death and says, "O you soul in peace and the self at peace. Irji'i ila rabbiki radiyatan mardiyah. Come back to your Lord." And when He calls us back, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the nafs itself, that soul, will be well pleased, and Allah will be well pleased with that soul. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَادْخُلِي فِي عِبَادِي وَادْخُلِي جَنَّتِي. Enter with my servants and enter my Jannah. So this is the call that's made to that type of soul, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely to make us among those, that type of soul, and to have the best of our deeds be the last of our deeds. Allahumma ameen. The second type of soul is a nafs al-ammara, and a nafs al-ammara is the soul that urges evil. This is the soul that basically sees good as bad and bad as good, black as white and white as black. This is the soul that feeds on sin. This is the soul that calls the person towards whatever is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We seek refuge from ever having this type of soul. And then there's one that's in the middle, and I think that this is where the majority of Muslims would fall, and that's a nafs al-lawama. Nafs al-lawama is the self-reproaching soul. And this is the soul which is torn, right? And sometimes it just depends on what's pulling it. So sometimes it's pulled in the direction of good, and sometimes more in the direction of evil. And it's constantly in that battle. And this whole life, is this struggle against the self. And inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make that struggle easy on us, and inshallah to make us victorious against the nafs. Now here's the last question. It's a similar question to the one that was just asked. Is our thoughts considered to be part of our nafs? Because sometimes one can waste time thinking about past events or daydreaming, wasting time. Hence I'm asking whether it's part of the nafs and hence need to control our thoughts. This is a good question about thoughts. The idea of thoughts is really the connection between thoughts and action, I think. That your thoughts, there's a strong relationship between our thoughts and then what becomes our habits. And so it's very, very difficult to break a habit once it's formed. But if you can address that habit before it's formed, or prevent that habit before it's formed, it will be much easier. And that point where you can address or prevent the habit is at the point of the thought, or even before the thought, the khawatir, the pre-thought, just those those thoughts that just kind of go through your mind and they're just like instantaneous and then they leave. If we sit and we indulge in those fleeting thoughts, then they become full-on ideas or full-on thoughts, and then that leads to the next step and the next step. And so the easiest way to control behavior is to control the thoughts. So definitely part of tazkiyatun nafs, the purification of the self, is in purifying and controlling the thoughts. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم. سبحانك الله وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.